How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I've got a very special guest for you all. Today, I'm joined by a coach at Reactive Training Systems. He is also the head coach of the Thailand National Powerlifting team. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Peter Lucey. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you for having me. And, pleasure to come on and looking forward to having the chat.
Yeah, no worries at all. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. So I know obviously I did a little bit of an introduction there, but how are you? What have you been up to? What's been happening in your world recently?
I think I'm very good, as in I've been based here in Bangkok, Thailand for about 7 years now, working full time in powerlifting, coaching lifters from many different countries. So kind of I suppose my roles are kind of split with mainly with the reactive training system, but also with the national team here in Thailand, which is awesome because we get to travel a lot for competitions. We just got back from the World Championships in Malta. We had a quick turnover to the Asian, Pacific, and African Championships then in Hong Kong, which was the week after. So, and now just getting ready and kind of getting things tuned up to go to Romania for the juniors coming up next month.
Oh, nice. Lots of things to keep you busy then. I think as well, the amount of traveling, is that just a bonus if you like, or do you get to see some of the places that you get to go to?
Usually, I try and make some time. So Malta didn't really get much time because we had the championships. Literally, I flew back, had one day, and then had to fly there. So, but usually I'll take a few days and just kind of be able to see some because I suppose from a coaching perspective, it's different a little bit to an athlete because you're pretty much on every day.
Yeah.
So you don't really during the competition get any time to, chill out or just relax. You might get the odd day here or there where you might have an easier schedule, but you also got to keep on top of your normal work too. So usually you're fairly shoulder to the wheel during the competition weeks. So usually, if I can, I'll take 3 or 4 days to explore whichever country or city we're in. And so after Romania, I'm going to take a couple of days and just kind of do a little bit of a tour around because it's my first time there. I think it could be a shame to kind of not be able to see some of the sites.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be really, really good. So I know, obviously, I mentioned, coaching with RTS, being based, working with the Thailand national team. But for everyone listening who might not know your background, how you got involved in powerlifting in terms of your coaching career, if you like, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself.
Yeah, so I would have originally gotten involved in back when I was in university. So I'm from Ireland, from Cork, Ireland originally, and went to university in Cork. And just kind of around that time was kind of, I suppose, a time where the sport kind of was starting to kind of take up, a little bit of traction back home as well. So, and it's become a lot more popular since that time as well. So it's kind of the early days, we'll say. And I suppose originally what I was studying sports and stuff like this in university, so I was kind of in that area and field already and at the time playing like Gaelic football and other sports and doing a bit of boxing and stuff like this. So originally started kind of really getting into the lifting to support those sports, we'll say. Started to kind of enjoy and get more into the lifting side than that. So that's kind of started to rise up in terms of what I was kind of going in after. And then just kind of went in from there. Actually, we kind of started to get involved with powerlifting. We had just kind of put together a crew out of our gym that we had there at the university. You started going to competitions and put together kind of a club, which I kind of at that time almost de facto became the person trying to that was kind of organizing and taking care of that. We'll say so. Just kind of happened because I guess somebody at that time needed to fill that role and then just kind of snowballed in from there as well. And I kind of fell in love with the sport, just kind of got deeper into various different aspects of it then as well as we went along. I moved away from home about 7 years ago now. Originally was the plan just to go for a year, come back or something like this, but the life takes unexpected turns, and I find myself here now, and things worked out pretty well. So pretty happy with how everything's kind of shaped out.
Yeah, nice. And with that, obviously, along the way, especially from starting out in powerlifting, at university in a university gym, what kind of you learn, along the way, or what was a better way of phrasing that? Who's kind of been your influences on, I don't know whether you would say style or your philosophies around or your approach to
Yeah.
training and coaching.
Yeah. So I suppose in those early days when we just got in, of course, like most people, we're just kind of, figuring things out as we go type of thing. But I suppose actually it was actually a lot of stuff from RTS and from kind of the stuff that Mike was putting out kind of was resonated for me and kind of started for me to kind of frame how I don't know, just when you look through lots of different stuff, especially you're taking information from lots of different sources, but the stuff there from the RTS side just kind of made a lot of sense to me, and it kind of fit with the things that I was kind of found myself, when you'd see things happening in training during the training process, you'd find certain things popping up, and those things like, like, okay, why do we have to do this? Why can't we do X, Y, Z? And the kind of style and approach to with the emergent strategies, for example, just really kind of I remember when I took that course first, because then I enrolled a while back after that then in the emergent strategies course as well. So that's kind of where I started to get into the deep dive, we'll say. And I remember going through the course and I'm just kind of looking at the lessons and I'm thinking, man, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I was like, I was pondering these things and now it's kind of, it kind of speaks to me in the sense of like, it seemed very logical to me. And I kind of started to kind of take that in, get deeper into the kind of emerging strategies. And of course, what I like about it and what I think is one of the big powers of it is that at the end of the day, it boils down to finding what works well for the athlete. And there's so many levers that you can pull. And it's kind of like if a certain lever, even if it's kind of against what would be, we all have our personal bias for things that we like and we tend to gravitate towards. So let's just say being able to kind of recognize that, okay, this lifter responds well or does well with something that is kind of away from my own personal bias, and being comfortable to go in that direction with them is very powerful. And it's kind of like, why restrict yourself that? So I kind of liked, and I kind of just, that makes sense to me. I kind of took the emergent strategies course, started kind of, I was working with some lifters, had the opportunity then, of course, when a spot opened up with RTS a number of years ago. So went through the interview process, got selected, and the things have just been picking up really nicely since then. So I suppose the cool thing is that I kind of, the source and the people who were my main source of inspiration and kind of really kind of, I think, added to what I could offer as a coach, I ended up being able to kind of join that then, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I can 100% appreciate that. With that as well, obviously, taking a lot of stuff from RTS, the emerging strategies. How have you found sort of, especially with working with, different lifters from different countries, working with the Thailand national team, but then also, other lifters or other gyms that you've been in. How have you found sort of the environment and cultures in different gyms, if you like, to try and maybe adapt to that, or maybe try and get the best out of the lifter there, and how much influence does that have? And I realize I kind of like snowballed you a couple of questions there.
No, that's okay. And it's interesting because I suppose one of the strengths of it is it can take many approaches. So let's just say you have lifters who are comfortable in let's say a more block periodization kind of traditional structure. Now, again, if that's worked very well for a lifter and it's consistently shown progress, well, there's probably something there that you want to kind of realize. So, I don't see any reason why there can't be elements of that in, but it's also, something that, let's explore out some other stuff too. And we could, let's say, add to that. So those things I think can be incorporated into kind of emergent strategies framework there as well. And interesting because some regions and kind of areas kind of have, traditionally this is the kind of approaches that were undertaken. And of course, a lot of folks, let's just say, may have started with a certain approach and had success with that, especially for a long time. And of course, I think all the time when we start, those early days, we work with certain approaches, you're going to make gains because you're starting, so it can be very easy to then kind of, I suppose, get attached to those kind of approaches that made you the initial spurt of progress. But I think sometimes then, of course, it's like, okay, when you get to that intermediate level, you get to that higher level and you're no longer kind of just realizing those, I suppose, easier gains. Now, it's natural to feel that attachment to it, but it's kind of like, how can you keep sustainably? And of course, we all know that the lifters who really rise to the top are those ones who can 5, 6, 7 years down the road still find ways to sustainably keep making progress and pushing forward. So I think it's interesting because I've worked with a number of lifters there who've kind of come from certain systems, we'll say, and certain backgrounds. They might have come and kind of signed up with RTS then because they're looking for, been stuck for a while. They've had good success in certain things, but maybe they're looking for a different flavor. They're curious about the approach. It's quite different. So it is interesting when you start working with a lifter who is, coming from a very different background in terms of their approach. And there's a couple lifters I've worked with, like from kind of Russia, and they've had a very set kind of structure, which has been successful. And it's interesting because quite often they're very, it should be this way, this is the way it's supposed to be, and all this kind of thing. So when they take in like an emergent strategies approach, they're very guarded at first sometimes. So I remember this particular lifter was very kind of cagey at the start and was very kind of, I'm not so sure about this, even just kind of using RPEs in any really sense. So we kind of layered them in at first with, using a mixture of RP and percentage stuff to kind of keep them comfortable. And it's funny because then we kind of had a little process at the start as well, where you got to explore a little bit to kind of see the lifter's response, a little bit of troubleshooting. So I remember in particular, we had a block that went pretty okay, then a block that didn't go great, but actually that block kind of gave a lot of very interesting information. And then the next block, we kind of had that little bit of spark of information on stuff that had been okay, stuff that wasn't so great. And now we were able to kind of dial things in on the next one. And that block just took off. And it was kind of like you could see, I suppose, that particular lifter kind of opening up to, whoa, they were kind of pushing in. It's like, what do you mean I can do singles pretty frequently? What, kind of this kind of went from that are thinking, oh, I did a single last week, I'm doing it again kind of thing. Being like that, that should be something that you do after 12 weeks of a full cycle or something. And then once they kind of start to see progress come in, they start to see, actually, I feel grand, I feel fine doing this. And then it kind of, you could see that kind of buy-in coming in, which was quite cool. And it was just kind of cool to see that kind of emerging out over time. But I think it's interesting. And at the end of the day, I think if a lifter starts to make progress and they start to kind of see some results coming, and it's kind of like, wow, I don't feel beat up all the time, and I'm making progress. Because a lot of the time, I suppose, if your main metric is volume, there comes a point where you just get kind of beat up or something like this. So it's a very viable option, but it's not the only option that's kind of available as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, and there's been times where I suppose we've had lifters who've kind of come over from different approaches, and you kind of do a bit of, because we use a lot of the stress index when we're calculating things like workload, and you do a little bit of reverse engineering, just on, let's just say, on their training they've been doing previously, just to kind of get an idea where the stress index may sit roughly on that. And sometimes it can be like, oh wow, okay, and then actually just by kind of dialing that around a little bit, all of a sudden, they start to feel better, they start to kick in as well. So it can be kind of a useful to help branch on from things or different approaches as well, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think what's the because you do find that sometimes, and even not just when we're talking about different powerlifting countries or anything like that, but even coaches can attach themselves to a certain style of training,
Yeah.
and it's kind of, oh well, at some point someone's going to benefit from this style of training. Doesn't matter who kind of like falls by the wayside.
Yeah.
Why do you think sometimes coaches, attach themselves to a certain method rather than maybe adapting themselves to the lifter, or being able to adjust as you go?
Yeah, I guess it kind of gives a safe start, a place to kind of operate within, we'll say. And I suppose any system that's kind of got a track record and exists and been used by a lot of people, well, the framework must work in a pretty reasonable amount of time. So again, there's a reason why that system kind of exists as opposed to some other thing that nobody does. So I guess it's kind of a safe place to start. And I guess we all kind of start there when we're kind of really feeling ourselves out in terms of, let's just say, when you start coaching, you start programming, so on and so forth, you got to start somewhere. So I think the main thing is that it's okay to start with something like this, but then don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to kind of break the rules a little bit if you think that that's going to be productive to kind of come in. So I think the real key lies in that you're able to kind of branch out from that then over time, and kind of not stay in your kind of safe zone, because again, we mentioned just briefly earlier things like we all have some personal bias, be it towards a certain style of training. I think it's very powerful for a coach to be able to operate outside of that too. And doesn't mean you shouldn't have any, or you should be completely, we all have our fundamental kind of, I suppose, foundations or things that we kind of hang our hat on a little bit more than others, and that's totally fine. And but again, it's that doesn't have to be always the same answer, we'll say, or having that freedom and flexibility to a lot of coaching boils down to problem solving and creativity. So it's kind of like, how creative can you be when something pops up? Can you, or is it always just hammer the same answer and just kind of hope it sticks kind of thing? So I think sometimes there's a little bit of you got to take a little bit of a risk and explore things as well, and being comfortable with that. And I think that feeds back then to communication with your lifter, in the sense that if you are exploring something that's quite different, well, letting them know that. And sometimes some lifters find that very exciting as well. They're kind of like, oh, I'm kind of curious to see how this goes. And of course, the nature of exploring something is that you're kicking over rocks to see what's underneath. Sometimes you're going to find something good. Sometimes there might be a little hole. But that's kind of the nature of the process. And it's funny that sometimes those blocks that may not go so great in that moment feed you on towards things that work out very well, because it kind of gives you some useful information in that way too. So it's kind of being able to kind of navigate that through. I think that communication process then with the athletes, so they're part of the process, and it's let's just say, depending how closely you kind of communicate and work with your athletes, it's very important to have that kind of buy-in, and that you're kind of on this little kind of exploratory journey together, I guess.
Yeah. Do you think that's just the natural progression of a coach? Because I know for myself, it's kind of a couple of parts to this. I know for myself, I competed a couple of years in powerlifting before I actually felt probably confident enough to actually coach lifters, coming from a rugby background. Obviously, squatting and benching and deadlifting was bread and butter, if you like. But then you could put that into an actual competitive sport. You've got to look at the rules, you've got to look at the depth. Make sure you know everything into the sport, and then actually being able to replicate that with the lifters that you're coaching, and as well experiencing or reading on different methods. When I first started, I remember I just did a 12-week program leading up to a competition, and then I was like, oh, okay, what could I tweak? What could I do from there? Do you think it's a natural progression for coaches getting involved in powerlifting to play around with their own training at first, and then try and be a little bit more creative, and have that knowledge to then work with lifters? But then also, if a coach doesn't experiment with their own training, they find something works, that it's just right, that must be the only bit, and just think that their way is going to be the best way because it's worked for them rather than a wider population.
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to how a lot of, I think, coaches kind of emerge in. We generally start as lifters and athletes ourselves. You cut your teeth here for a while. Even for me, I was competing myself first. Now I kind of de facto in university kind of fell into role doing other things too, which is a little bit unexpected, I suppose, which also kind of kicked along the road of being a coach as well. So in a way that was lucky. I think it's kind of a natural progression. You do need, I think, it's not mandatory for a good coach to have been a great lifter, we'll say. But I think it is important that you've had that experience of what it feels like to compete and kind of go through a prep and this kind of stuff, because I competed for a number of years myself. I had a lot of kind of injuries, which kind of ended up pushing my emphasis away from being an athlete myself, more towards the coaching role earlier on, because I just had a notoriously bad kind of back and hip, and in a way those things, I suppose, actually put me down the rabbit hole of trying to learn more about the process of being efficient and clean training, this kind of stuff. So in a way, those things that stopped me being an athlete kind of, I think, made me better as a coach. So there's kind of a little de facto there. And yeah, so I think it is kind of good to be able to explore in with your own training, then branch things out. I think it's very important not to get too attached on what works for yourself. And I think it is a bit of a pitfall that it can be very easy to fall into as well. And especially, I think, with lifters who are very talented themselves, and then doing some coaching, because it comes easier to, or let's say, in a way we could say, to for somebody who's very, very talented. So being able to relate to working with a lifter who's a very different body proportion and leverages to yourself, so it does pose kind of challenges. And I think being that creativity and that kind of open-mindedness is very important, but also just that kind of situational awareness to, yes, that works well for me as an athlete, but I'm very different to this person. And, I think that freedom to tinker around is very, very important. and just not to pigeonhole yourself. And it's kind of that exploratory process as well. So I think it's a natural kind of progression through. I think your own training is a nice little place to experiment with some different stuff, and it's but not to kind of, I suppose, typecast yourself in with that either as well, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think it is, what I quite like about powerlifting is it is problem solving, like what you mentioned, a little bit earlier. Because if something's working and all of a sudden, I know I've had it, and I'm sure you've had it either in your own training or with athletes that you've worked with. All of a sudden, you find something and squat absolutely is flying, but then all of a sudden it's like, right, well, why isn't what's happening with bench? That isn't playing ball. And sometimes that can be slightly
Yeah.
different heading into different competitions. I think one thing that I wanted to touch on, just going back to sort of, looking at the different cultures and environments of training. You look at like French powerlifting at the minute. Really, 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 really strong in terms of the lifters that
Yeah.
they've got at the minute. Is there similarities or main similarities that you find in terms of a successful environment or being able to produce lifters? And by that I mean for a long period of time, rather than having a big shoot up and then actually they've not there, compared to the more successful lifters or coaching teams.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I suppose even just referencing how the environment here in Thailand is, so the sport is still relatively new here. It's kind of a country that's kind of only had a team. I think the first year we had a team internationally was 2019. So it's still quite new, and it's kind of a burgeoning up, but the growth rate is quite strong. So it's kind of in a way, I suppose, coming from a little bit of a clean slate in terms of, let's say, training methods and stuff like this, because only the last couple of years has there really been kind of a structure. Now there was some competitions happening before that, but they probably would have been more just kind of local level, gyms organizing some events type of thing. So it's kind of interesting because the uptake is then very quick and very fast. And since that time, we've had every competition, we've had bigger teams and more successful teams kind of going to these championships, be it masters and juniors. And actually the juniors are really kicking up a lot, which is a very good sign. So it's one of those things where there's like the whole Asian region in general is really on the come up as well, which is going to be very interesting. Especially like the last Asian Championships that we had last December was the biggest that there's ever been. There was like
Right.
over 400 lifters or something. So
Wow.
like, and the standard of the lifting is going up exponentially. So the difference from the Asian Championships we had in 2019 to the one last year was in terms of just sheer numbers of people, in terms of the standards of each division was just shooting up as well. So I think it's going to be interesting to really see how that kind of is already in worlds where this one was the biggest one that there's been as well. So I think there's a lot of very good kind of young junior lifters kind of coming up as well. Of course, like things like lifters having the ability to get competitions is going to be a challenge and obstacle in terms of it's not terribly cheap to get to a big competition.
Yeah. I think it's really good to see the growth, especially I think, this world was the most lifters there. I think, that the worlds this year coming straight after Sheffield as well. I know I've spoken about this quite a lot. I think, there is a real excitement around the sport of powerlifting, and people are wanting to get involved with it, and I think the entry point for that is people can get involved in it, and more gyms and the content and everything like that out there is more accessible, which is really, really good. I think when we obviously you've spoken about there with the growth of powerlifting and kind of transitioning more to the coaching and training side of things. We've spoken there about a lot of different thoughts and philosophies around training, and I think the main kind of phrase that was going through my head was sort of efficiency, because you can put efforts into doing things that aren't going to reap the rewards. You just kind of not flogging a dead horse, but trying to keep training without actually seeing any progress. So I think the main question from there is, what does efficiency of training and programming look like to you?
Yeah, so I think especially with an emergent strategies approach, that kind of feedback and that keeping a kind of I suppose a finger on the pulse of how the training is going is very important. So and that means that it's a fairly high touch approach in terms of there's a pretty consistent contact with the athletes. Personally, in terms of, let's say, check-ins with athletes, I do check-ins every single day, and it's kind of part of my just daily flow, we'll say, because I also kind of prefer the kind of quick frequent check-ins as opposed to kind of, oh, here's the weekly or the monthly kind of thing as well, just because for my own process, that helps me kind of build a timeline in my head of just how the training is going, how things are emerging, and how things are kind of developing as we go through. So it's kind of like I like that kind of finger on the pulse kind of approach in. So of course, that means that when things are a little bit more high touch like that, then the processes need to be good to keep that feasible, and so that you're able to kind of direct your time and your energy and your mental energy towards, not losing time on kind of menial tasks of, data collection or something like this. So like we're lucky with RTS is that we have with our we have our website, and of course on the website we have every lifter has their training log. Now anyone can sign up and get a training log on the website, and it's free as well, which is a nice handy way if people want something to collect data on their training, and they can run block reviews and all this kind of stuff. So that's available to anyone. And so when we're working with an athlete, they have their training log, and that kind of feeds into my kind of coaching dashboard, which allows me to write training, pull all the information from training. So having a system like that saves a lot of time, of course, on every time the athlete, updates something in their notes or, records their training or something like this, that comes straight through automatically. So I have a kind of a running kind of I suppose the command center, seeing how everything is going, and then then through the contact with the athlete, as most lifters will send on their feedback to the session, their videos after the session, and then we come along and we kind of have a look through, and then it's just kind of keeping making those adjustments as needed. If everything's all good, then okay, let's keep plowing on with that, the block review process. But I think having an efficient kind of system and practice like that, so you're not spending so much time, let's just say you want a way that you can see the important information quickly and use it actionably, as opposed to, and of course, it's not just about getting as much information as you possibly can, because are you actually using that information? So the block review process, I think, is very important, and it kind of gives the important stuff. And then, of course, things like the stress, we use a lot of the estimated 1 rep max, but also the kind of meta reviews. So I kind of have I call it my athlete playbook there as well, which I kind of use to kind of pull information from the block reviews into the longer scheme of time. And I find that very useful for building out that kind of framework between, not just in the overall sense, but you start to notice things like certain strategies work better for a lifter squat, but for the bench press, those kind of strategies need to be a little bit different. So a lot of the times with the emergent strategies, of course, they'll branch off each other. So you might have a lifter who's got 3 distinct strategies on the 3 lifts, and that's kind of that sweet spot that's going to come in, especially as, let's just say, we have a lifter who's going in towards competition. That last block for the competition is what we sometimes call the greatest hits block, where she's kind of all the amalgamation of all those stuff that's been really good kind of paired in together. So we'll have exploratory blocks, which are kind of feeling things out. We'll have focused development blocks where we're trying to zero things in. So maybe we're bringing back in a style of strategy that was very fruitful in the past, coming off an exploratory block maybe. So it's kind of gathering all that stuff, bringing them in. But and actually one of the things that have been doing quite a bit recently as well is that we have our RTS training lab. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but
yeah,
the again, providing that, so for, let's say, coaches who are not RTS coaches but are coaching lifters themselves, that they can use these tools, which is quite useful, and they can use that to write training, deploy training, monitor the training through their dashboard, and just cut down. Because I remember when I originally started working with RTS, at the time before that, I'd been kind of using Google Sheets, and I had like my Google Sheet that I'd kind of created and tinkered with over time, that I was like super proud of at the time and everything like this. And but only when I started work with RTS and I was able to kind of then use the training log, will say, I was like, man, I had no idea how much time I spent on menial tasks that didn't help the lifter or process. And actually, the time savings in terms of, wow, now I can just focus on that important stuff, be it writing training, feedback to lifters, looking through their block reviews and their responses. That should be the majority of the time that you spend, not transferring data. Oh, let me just type this out, this kind of stuff. So, and then of course, as you're working through and working with various lifters, that keeps you kind of fresh to do the important stuff and allows you to kind of, function with them, depending how many lifters on your roster as well.
Yeah, nice. And with that, why I wanted to ask that question about, what does efficiency look like to you? I think, sometimes we can get so hung up on, or coaches can get so hung up on right, I need to put the best program together for the lifter, whereas actually everything that you've touched on there is the systems in the background. And actually, by filtering those things out, focusing on the big rocks, it's going to allow you to be, a lot more efficient and actually, give the lifter what they need. Do you think by filtering out those smaller tasks that are going to take up a lot of time, that you'll actually see, more progress from the programming and more success with the lifter, because you've kind of all of a sudden created a little bit more time to be like, right, I can have a look over their training footage, I can actually dive into, right, actually, when you're keeping your finger on the pulse, you can be like, okay, I can change things a little bit quicker and can pick up on things a little bit quicker to make sure that we're looking after the lifter better.
Yeah, I think it's important because you're cutting out the stuff that's like kind of unnecessary, we'll say. So that does, of course, naturally, by freeing up more time and mental energy as well, and just kind of because if you're totally burned out and you've been going for 10 hours and now you're trying to check in on someone, maybe you're not going to be able to kind of operate at the same capacity you normally would. So I think that efficiency is important as well. But, I think having that, and also it cuts through the noise, because there can be quite a lot of noise that builds up as well if you just have reams and reams and reams of kind of data. And again, some of it's more useful than others. How do you kind of zero in and cut through the stuff where it's actually going to give you actionable, useful information, or maybe it just keeps you driving around in circles? And also, of course, how that maps out over time is very important. So let's just say, even if a block is very successful, it's important just to look at the context of the block, like where that is in terms of, let's just say, you might have lifters when they're doing kind of more high rep, kind of more hypertrophy spec blocks. The gain rates are awesome. It looks great. But does it translate down to what we need to do when we go to a competition, we'll say, which is that heavier low rep stuff? So that context then, of course, is another important layer where it's like, otherwise it's kind of like, wow, we did excellent here, but then things kind of held, and then and we didn't have the result we wanted to the competition. Well, there's an opportunity there to kind of drill down and say, okay, how can we bring what we saw on the Sparks here to the platform and get that translation over, because the trends and the responses are very important. Now, the ultimate goal at the end of the day is bigger totals, bigger lifts in the competition, and pushing that heavy single, we'll say. And I think it's one of those things that you need to, when you see something that responds well, so let's just say lower RP work or high rep work or something like this, which is can be a very powerful training strategy or protocol. And if you see that those kind of things respond very well, it's kind of like, awesome, great, let's lean into that. But then it's just keeping in mind too that, okay, ultimately we need this to carry over into getting a heavier squat in the competition, or being able to kind of produce that. And, just kind of not losing sight on that, because, sometimes you'll see, lifters in training, things trend so well, but then it just doesn't carry in, we'll say. So it's kind of just finding that spark, I think, and cutting down the noise, being able to focus your efforts and time on the kind of valuable stuff, and being able to spend more time. Let's just say if you're able to keep contact with your lifter, multiple times a week, you're going to have a much bigger picture on how they're feeling, and that relationship side of things, which is also very important. Get to know a lifter, and you kind of get to know their personality, how they feel about certain things. That feeds into things like feedback, but also in terms of writing the training, as in, so I think that's massively important. And it's kind of that we're in this together. We're kind of navigating through on this journey. So, even just being able to jump on a chat, even if it's not even about directly about training stuff, that's productive. Just see how you feel and how you're getting on. Everything's okay. Life happens outside of training too, and that affects training as well. So, I think being able to, you know, connect with your athletes on that kind of personal level is also kind of an important quality. Helps build relationships. You work together, you gel well together, and that's kind of that nice sweet spot in terms of coaching as well, because it's people working with people, and there's so much about numbers and videos, and of course especially in online setting, because you may never physically meet somebody that you're working with. Now it's cool when you get the opportunity to do that, and but being able to have that little personal side of it, I think is rewarding and very important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with that, you touched on a lot of there about the communication side of things, and I think that's one of the. I think it's the art of coaching, if you like. You are actually dealing with a person, and they're going to have their own thoughts, and what's going to work well for them. I think one thing, obviously, I know we've spoken about what is efficiency there, but sometimes, because they might have either worked with a different coach, or they might have come from a different sport, which a lot of people, I've seen a lot of lifters come from a lot more team sports, like myself.
Yeah.
Coming from rugby and getting involved in powerlifting. How does what's your approach if it isn't fitting within the system in terms of having it as efficient, if a lifter's got something attached to it which is something that isn't actually a big rock, but to them it feels as though it's a big rock? Is it, what's your approach to that? Is it still sort of like emphasizing that, or working with them to maybe make them realize that actually it's not that important, or kind of going along with them because it's important to that lifter? Because like you say, that relationship, that trust is going to be really important.
Yeah, so usually I think that let's just say the intent and the execution behind what you're doing is very important, and kind of communicating that through with the lifters. So let's just say if there's something there that, maybe they're getting very hung up on a certain thing, but it's not that big of a thing. Well, I think it's one thing to say, and especially because if something maybe, for some reason be quite important to that person, I don't think it's a productive just be like, oh, that's not important, or dismissive of something like that, but also kind of approaching that in a way that's kind of productive. So instead of just kind of brushing something off or not approaching it, or say, you could also be like, well, look, this is what we're seeing in terms of the number here in training. This is kind of what we're trying to focus on. So let's just say when we're choosing to do a certain movement or a protocol, and we're trying to work on something, just clearly explaining out, okay, this is why we're doing this. So why are we doing heavy low pin squats? Well, this is kind of what we're trying to develop, what we're trying to go after. If we look at some of your past videos here, we start to see that this is maybe that little breakdown that we're trying to go after. And then, of course, now the lifter is kind of armed with that information on the intent behind why they're doing a certain thing as they approach it on the training. And I think that kind of works well, instead of just, oh, I guess I'm doing these week. So it's kind of like, they're like, all right, this is what I need to go after. And then I think that way kind of nicely, let's just say, allows them to see that, okay, based on that training information, okay, sure. Sometimes, for example, you have lifters who, let's say, things will be going really, really well, and they've strung multiple good blocks together, and then maybe they have a down week or two, and they get pretty bummed out, and they're like, oh man, maybe they missed a rep, or things just didn't really, they went in, it just, everything felt super heavy. And then it's kind of like putting that back into context, and it's kind of like, well, in the last 2 months you've gone from here to here, and now you're kind of here on that bad day, we'll say. So we're in a pretty good spot here. And again, sometimes, different lifters with different responses. Some actually have in their general response kind of down weeks that we can almost pre-predict as well. So I have one guy in particular, and it's funny because his week 3 is always going to be, and then on his week 4. And of course, at the start, that's kind of, he's like, oh my God, things fell off a cliff here on week 3. And they were like, all right, let's hold tough and let's just see how things play out. And then boom. And now 6 or 7 blocks later, you see this very similar trend all the time. So it's kind of being able to navigate those things through, that communication process, that, well, actually, this is kind of where we see your response coming in, and it's super consistently, followed by kind of a big bounce back session there as you come along. So, navigating through, and now it's kind of like, it's just, it's not something that phases him anymore. And it's kind of takes that in a stride, moves forward and builds on from there. I think the intent and the communication, so you're on the same page with that intent, is like very powerful. And, so the lifter's not just getting a program and, okay, I guess I got to do this, how just, I suppose, having that connection with, okay, why are we doing this strategy or this movement or protocol? And, that goes a long way into kind of, keeping things moving in a good direction, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, like what you said, not we've spoken about, what is going to be an approach that's going to fit for everybody. Whereas actually, like what you mentioned about that lifter there, like every third week, it's going to take a little bit of a dive. There are going to be, everyone's going to be different in how they're going to respond to things, and one norm for one person isn't going to be the other. Because you don't know, what their work schedule is like. I've got a couple of lifters that work shifts or work away. So obviously, all of a sudden, their training is going to take a little bit of a dip, and you've got to adapt to that. But that goes back to right at the start what we spoke about in terms of why people enjoy powerlifting is it's problem solving, and always chasing that bigger single, that bigger total, because you can always keep progressing and keep developing from there. We've spoken about sort of coaching with individual lifters and the approach around that. I kind of wanted to touch on kind of your role as a head coach of a national team, and I think sometimes for people are maybe a little bit unsure of what does that actually look like, and especially with the growth of Thailand powerlifting, the Asian countries in terms of how they're developing their powerlifting and their involvement in that. What does kind of your role involve? What part do you play in that?
Yeah, so mostly my role will be kind of the game day side of things and just taking care of the lifters. And we're lucky here. We have kind of we're I suppose it's relatively new as well, but we have a pretty good team. Like we also have our president here, Kasim Sand, who you've probably seen at the 66s Open as well. So when he's not lifting, he's usually the guy in there with me as well, coming in. And we have a few other guys that we're kind of that we bring in. So we're putting together kind of like the kind of meet day team, we'll say. And of course, so my main role is to take care of the lifters on the day, again, at the competitions. And, again, if they have any questions or, need some support in the process going up to the competition then as well. Some of the lifters on the team will be my own personal athletes. Some are self-coached or swan support. So, there's a variety, of course, like with any team there. But, my main thing is the meet day coaching, and just to kind of, I suppose, support the lifters, put them in the best position to be successful. I love meet day coaching. It's one of my favorite things to do, as well. So, it's kind of a role that I kind of really enjoy. But at the end of the day, it boils down to, for our lifters in our team, we want to be able to kind of allow them to get the best experience of a competition, not just on the day of their own competition, but that entire experience, I think, is very important for a lifter. They put a lot of time, they put a lot of money and effort into getting to that stage. So I think it's important that they're, taken care of when they do go there. And then, of course, trying to get the best results we can. And we've had some good success there recently at like Asian and Asia Pacifics, and at Worlds as well. And we've been just continuously building up our teams, which hopefully then will result in the lifters getting some, like, maybe government funding eventually down the way and stuff like this. So those are kind of things that if the results come, it opens up other doors here, which is something that we're trying to kind of keep working towards as well.
Yeah, nice. And with that as well, kind of, making sure that they've got the best experience on the day, especially with the manual that Matt Gary put out. And I think right now, game day coaching is really important. That's becoming kind of an art in itself. Is that where you can use when we're talking about it, touching on efficiency again, kind of a different set of data, if you like, or trying to see how you can actually help help the lifters kind of climb up and have that success, that if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, so that comes into things like, of course, like doing your scouting beforehand, so on and so forth. So, doing the scouting reports, and that's something that we do before we kind of go into, the major championships as well. So you have that idea, and of course, knowing your lifter in terms of, how they execute on the day, the kind of ranges that they're good for, and, of course, trying to put together a strategy that puts them in the best position to be successful. Now, that factors in, of course, how the day is playing out in terms of the numbers, selections, so on and so forth. So, it can become a bit of a chess match in that regard, which is, I think, the fun part of it. And I kind of, it's just fun to be involved in those kind of jostles when you're kind of coming in there as well. And of course, you have your game plan, but you also need to be flexible to the opportunities and challenges that then present during the day and be able to kind of make those adjustments quickly. And of course, be able to kind of crunch the math when things happen. If you're making attempt changes, when the deadlifts are coming down to the wire, making sure that you're getting the right number in, that you're not maybe showing your hand too soon, that you're kind of putting yourself in that kind of position. And it's something now, as our team grows, we're finding ourselves in those kind of jostles more and more, which is great, and it's always a fun one. And sometimes I work with lifters who are on other teams as well, so sometimes have the opportunity to support in when they're lifting as well, which is always kind of fun, and be able to kind of just kind of get in there. And I think it's a very different aspect of a competition for being a lifter as well, and it's one that I kind of very much enjoy. And that's why when we being the head coach as well, of course, we go to all the competitions. So there's kind of a very busy schedule the second half of the year, where we still have, this year we have the juniors in Romania, then we'll go to Mongolia for the Masters, and then we'll have the Asian Championships in Malaysia at the end of the year as well. So it's just giving that opportunity for lifters coming in, and just building things up, and just keep having these enjoyable fun trips. And I think every one of those events just kind of takes the whole thing a step forward. And I think there's a lot of momentum building across the board as well. We see this from Sheffield, we see this from Worlds, we see this from now the World Games is going to be a bigger thing, even more than it was next year as well. And there's some really cool momentum building up across the board.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with that as well, the key thing that I kind of took from that is momentum, and if, some lifters have a good competition and that goes into the next one, they have good experiences, and, they feel more, like what we spoke about at the start in terms of, environment, they feel more comfortable in that environment, especially, if everything is put in place, like what we touched on in terms of the systems when we spoke about efficiency. Quite a lot of topics spoken about there, Peter. A couple of tangents thrown in as, but from everything that we've spoken about today, Peter, and for everyone listening, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom?
I think one of the main things is don't be afraid to explore, be that in processes, be that in training response, and have there's a lot of opportunity that can present itself when you're kind of open to kind of take things down the rabbit hole, let's say. So that kind of feeds in from a lot of our approach, and I think a lot of the value that we can add to lifters is sometimes it's like, yeah, it's okay, let's pursue that, let's kind of go in there. If you see kind of sparks, it's kind of like, let's see where that leads us, we'll say, especially if you're a lifter who's been a bit stuck. And we've all had those periods of time where we get a bit stuck, be it in with problems, training or life or whatever it may be, and you can get very frustrated spinning the wheels, we'll say. But then, of course, just kind of being open to other things, and that kind of creativity, and finding maybe slightly off the beaten track or outside the box ways to solve those problems, which then all of a sudden could lead you down to some pretty productive stuff.
Yeah, nice. I think that is, it kind of sums up a lot of what we've spoken about, where you can, filter things through, get more efficient with that, but also, not being afraid to try things. And I think, if you have that communication and trust with the lifter, it's gonna make things work a lot better. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on, Peter. Really, really enjoyed chatting with you today. Some really interesting topics touched on there. If anyone has any questions about what we've spoken about today, or reach out to you, or even, work with yourself, where could people reach out to you or find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram, but my handle is just Peter underscore RTS. Or you could reach out via the RTS page as well. And then, of course, we have our website is www.reacttrainsystems.com. So if there's a ton of information and stuff like that, and there's a lot of stuff. Let's just say if somebody's curious about like emergent strategies or the train lab, so on and so forth, the website has a ton of stuff. Our YouTube has a lot of stuff kind of going through the kind of framework of that approach, we'll say. So there's a whole ton, and of course, we also have courses on the emergent strategies course, which is what I originally myself way back when kind of started off kind of taking. I suppose that was one of the real pivotal steps for my own kind of development as a coach as well. So yeah, those would be kind of the main areas.
Ah, nice, awesome. Well, thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on today. Really, really enjoyed chatting with you. Like I say, some really interesting and useful topics there, especially from a coach's point of view in terms of developing those systems and getting the most out of training and being able to explore from that. So thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.